She boarded the flight invisible to everyone. Flight attendants walked past her. Passengers never saw her face. No one knew she existed, until the plane's emergency forced F-22 fighter pilots to hear her call sign. In that moment, the most elite pilots in the world stopped cold in complete shock. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 767 sat at gate C-17 of Dulles International Airport as passengers filed through the jetway in their typical chaotic fashion, dragging carry-on luggage, checking boarding passes, and jostling for position in the narrow corridor that connected terminal to aircraft. Flight 2847 to Los Angeles was scheduled to depart at 1400 hours, and the gate agent had already begun the boarding process with her practiced announcements about zones and seat assignments. Among the stream of travelers moving through the doorway, between a businessman checking his phone and a mother wrestling with a toddler and diaper bag, a woman in her late 30s passed through without anyone's eyes focusing on her for even a fraction of a second. She wore dark jeans, a plain gray pullover, and running shoes that made no sound on the jetway floor. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a small black backpack that hung from one shoulder. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that would cause anyone to look twice, and yet it was more than simple ordinariness that made her invisible. It was as if she existed in a pocket of reality that human perception simply skipped over, the way eyes slide past empty space between objects of actual interest. Flight attendants standing at the aircraft door greeting passengers with their professional smiles looked directly through the space she occupied, their faces never registering that anyone had passed. The businessman who had been walking in front of her would later have no memory of anyone behind him. The mother with the toddler, who had been immediately behind her in line, would recall only empty space between herself and the businessman. The woman moved down the aisle of the aircraft with the same quality of non-presence, passing rows of passengers struggling with overhead bins and settling into seats. She was neither tall nor short, neither heavy nor thin, with features that were attractive but somehow refused to register in the memory of anyone who might have glanced her way. Row after row slipped past as she made her way toward seat 27F, a window seat in the economy cabin. A teenage boy sat in 27D, the aisle seat, already plugged into his headphones with his eyes closed. The middle seat, 27E, remained empty. The woman slid into the window seat with fluid economy of movement, placing her backpack under the seat in front of her and fastening her seatbelt. The teenage boy never opened his eyes, never shifted to acknowledge someone settling in beside him, though the movements should have created enough disturbance to register in his awareness. Throughout the boarding process, flight attendants made their way up and down the aisle, checking overhead bins, reminding passengers about electronic devices, and offering assistance with luggage. They passed row 27 repeatedly, attending to passengers in rows 26 and 28 with professional courtesy, but never once did their eyes track to the woman sitting at the window. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, breathing slowly and evenly, existing in a state that was both completely present and utterly absent from the perception of everyone around her. This was not an accident of circumstance or the simple luck of being unremarkable. This was the result of years of training in techniques that very few people in the world knew existed, methods developed in the darkest corners of special operations programs for individuals whose missions required them to move through the world like ghosts. Her name, though it appeared on the passenger manifest as Sarah Mitchell, was not actually Sarah Mitchell, nor was it any of the 17 other documented identities she maintained through various intelligence networks. Her real name was known to perhaps a dozen people in the entire United States government, all of whom held security clearances so high that the classifications themselves were classified. She had learned to become invisible not through technology or special equipment, but through an understanding of human perception and attention that bordered on the supernatural. She knew how to control her breathing, her micro-movements, her energy in a way that caused the human brain's pattern recognition systems to simply fail to register her presence. She understood the blind spots in human awareness, the way people unconsciously filter their environment, and she had trained herself to occupy those blind spots completely. The technique was taught in a facility that didn't appear on any map, run by an organization whose acronym was known only to the president, the Secretary of Defense, and a handful of others in the intelligence community. The training took 3 years and had a 97% washout rate. Those who completed it became something beyond special forces, beyond intelligence operatives, beyond any conventional category of military or government service. They were instruments of national security used only in situations where conventional resources, no matter how elite, could not achieve the objective. Their missions were never documented, their successes never celebrated, their very existence a secret that would never be declassified. She had completed that training 14 years ago, and in the years since had conducted operations on 6 continents that had prevented catastrophes most people would never know had threatened them. She had walked through enemy installations where a single misstep would mean not just death but the unraveling of strategic operations that protected millions. She had sat in rooms with terrorists, warlords, and corrupt officials who were actively looking for threats while she gathered intelligence from arm's length away. She had boarded aircraft, trains, and ships that were under the highest security protocols and moved through them like smoke through a screen door. Today she was simply traveling home after an operation in the Washington area that had concluded successfully 72 hours earlier. She could have taken military transport, could have requested any number of secure conveyance options, but she preferred commercial flights when possible. They provided opportunities to maintain skills, to test herself in real-world environments, and to move through society without the complications that came with official channels. She had cleared security at Dulles by walking through the TSA checkpoint in the wake of a large family group, her credentials identifying her as Sarah Mitchell, though the Transportation Security Administration officer who glanced at her ID would later have no memory of her face, unable to pick her out of a photo lineup even minutes after she passed through. The aircraft filled completely, every seat occupied by travelers heading to Los Angeles for business, vacation, family obligations, or the 1,000 other reasons people crisscrossed the country daily. The flight attendants completed their safety demonstration, speaking their rehearsed instructions about seatbelts and oxygen masks and emergency exits to passengers who mostly ignored them in favor of phones, magazines, or conversations. The woman in 27F watched the demonstration with complete attention, noting the locations of exits, the operation of the emergency door mechanism, the position of the oxygen masks and life vests. This was not anxiety about flight safety but professional habit, the constant assessment of environment and resources that was second nature to someone with her training. The teenage boy in 27D had not once looked in her direction. His eyes had opened when the flight attendant passed to check seatbelts, but they had tracked from the aisle directly to the window, somehow passing over the woman sitting at that window without registering her existence. When the flight attendant had asked if his seatbelt was fastened, he had confirmed it was, and the flight attendant's eyes had similarly skipped from the boy to the empty middle seat to the window showing tarmac beyond, never acknowledging the woman who sat precisely in that line of sight. It was a phenomenon that would seem impossible to anyone who witnessed it with full awareness, but no one aboard the aircraft had full awareness of her presence. Flight 2847 pushed back from the gate at 1400 hours exactly, and the pilots began their taxi toward the runway. The woman listened to the sounds of the aircraft, the whine of the auxiliary power unit, the rumble of the wheels on the taxiway, the changes in engine pitch as the pilots applied thrust. She could identify the aircraft type by sound alone, could track their progress by the pattern of turns and stops, could estimate with reasonable accuracy when they would begin their takeoff roll. These were not skills taught to covert operators specifically, but rather things she had learned because she was, before everything else that she had become, a pilot whose capabilities exceeded those of almost anyone who had ever sat in a cockpit. She had learned to fly at age 16 in a Cessna 172 at a small airport in Nebraska, had soloed before her 17th birthday, and had known from that first moment of lifting off the runway alone that flying was not just something she did but something she was. She had attended the Air Force Academy, had graduated at the top of her class, and had been selected for fighter training where her instructors quickly realized they were dealing with someone whose natural ability was extraordinary. She flew the T-38 Talon as if it were an extension of her own body, understanding the aircraft's capabilities and limitations instinctively, pushing boundaries while maintaining absolute control. Her stick and rudder skills were so refined that she could hold formation within inches at 400 knots, could judge angles and distances with uncanny precision, and could make the aircraft do things that seemed to violate physics. After advanced training, she had been assigned to fly F-16 Fighting Falcons with the 421st Fighter Squadron at Hill Air Force Base, where she had proven herself not just as an exceptional pilot but as a tactician whose understanding of air combat was sophisticated beyond her years. She had deployed to combat zones, had flown missions that earned her decorations that remained classified, and had developed a reputation among other fighter pilots as someone whose skills existed in a category above even the elite community in which she operated. But her abilities had been noticed by people beyond the Air Force, and she had been recruited into programs that existed in shadows so deep that most military personnel didn't know they were possible. The aircraft lifted off from Dulles with the familiar acceleration that pressed passengers back into their seats, climbing into the autumn sky over Virginia. The woman watched the ground fall away through the window beside her, seeing the landscape shrink and transform into the abstract patterns of roads and buildings and forests that became visible from altitude. The teenage boy in 27D had fallen asleep almost immediately after takeoff, his head tilted back against the seat, mouth slightly open, completely unaware of the presence beside him. Other passengers around them were settling into their flights, some reading, some watching entertainment on seatback screens, some already dozing. She remained perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, breathing in the slow rhythm that kept her metabolism low and her presence minimal. She could maintain this state for hours without discomfort, could remain so still that even someone looking directly at her would find their attention sliding away after a few seconds. It was a form of meditation that she had learned from an instructor whose background was in intelligence operations in Southeast Asia during the Cold War, techniques adapted from practices that were centuries old but refined for modern operational requirements. The instructor had told her that the human mind could not truly be invisible, but it could become quiet enough that other minds simply failed to notice it, like a sound below the threshold of hearing or a light below the threshold of vision. The flight reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Flight attendants emerged from their jump seats and began preparing the beverage service, rolling their carts from the forward galley. They worked their way down the aisle, taking drink orders and handing out small packages of pretzels, engaging in brief conversations with passengers who wanted to chat and efficiently serving those who didn't. When they reached row 27, they asked the teenage boy if he wanted anything to drink. He woke enough to request a Coke, received it with a sleepy nod, and immediately closed his eyes again. The flight attendants moved to row 28 without pausing, without any indication that they had seen the woman sitting beside the boy, despite the fact that they had looked directly at that space while serving him. The woman did not react to being passed over. She expected it, had made it happen through techniques that were automatic to her now, and did not need beverage service in any case. She carried water in her backpack and had no interest in the pretzels or other snacks that the airline provided. She ate carefully when on operations, maintaining nutrition and hydration without depending on external resources, another habit from training that emphasized self-sufficiency and independence from the environment. She could go days with minimal food if necessary, could function at high levels of performance while other people would be collapsing from hunger, but today was not an operation and she was simply being careful by habit. Time passed in the particular way it does on aircraft flights, simultaneously fast and slow, measured in the creeping progress across the route map displayed on seatback screens and the eternal sameness of sitting in a narrow seat with recycled air blowing from overhead vents. The woman watched clouds pass below the aircraft, tracked the angle of the sun as it moved across the sky, and monitored the subtle changes in engine sound that indicated different phases of flight. She was aware of everything around her while remaining completely unnoticed by everyone around her, existing in a state that was both present and absent in equal measure. 3 hours into the flight, somewhere over Kansas, the situation changed. The change began with a subtle variation in engine sound that most passengers would not have noticed but that immediately caught her attention. The pitch shifted slightly, became less smooth, developed a quality that suggested the engines were not operating at optimal parameters. She focused her hearing, filtering out the ambient noise of conversation and entertainment systems and crying babies, concentrating on the mechanical sounds that came through the aircraft's structure. There was definitely something wrong with the port engine, a vibration that shouldn't be present, a harmonics issue that indicated a developing problem. Within seconds of her noticing the anomaly, she heard the change in cockpit activity that confirmed her assessment. The aircraft's intercom system, when not in use for passenger announcements, could be heard faintly through the cabin if you knew how to listen, and she knew how to listen. She heard the pilots' voices become clipped and focused, heard the shift from routine operations to problem-solving mode, heard the specific terminology that indicated they were dealing with an engine issue. The vibration increased slightly, now noticeable to passengers who began looking around with expressions of concern. The seatbelt sign chimed on and the captain's voice came over the speakers with the carefully calm tone that pilots use when explaining problems to passengers. The captain informed them that they were experiencing a mechanical issue with one of the engines, that they were going to divert to Denver International Airport as a precaution, and that there was no immediate danger but they should return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. The announcement created the predictable response among passengers. Some became visibly anxious, some tried to peer out windows to see the engines, some remained calm, and some tried to ask flight attendants for more information than the captain had provided. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with professional reassurance, confirming that everything was under control and that diverting to Denver was standard procedure for mechanical issues. The woman in 27F listened to the sounds of the aircraft and knew that the situation was more serious than the captain had indicated. The vibration was increasing, and she could hear changes in the engine's operation that suggested they were losing containment, that internal components were beginning to fail in ways that could lead to catastrophic damage. She ran through the scenarios in her mind, calculating distances to Denver, considering the aircraft's performance on a single engine, evaluating the risks of continued flight versus immediate landing at a closer airport. She was not worried for her own safety in the way that other passengers might be worried, but she was professionally concerned about the developing situation. The aircraft began its descent toward Denver, and the pilots worked through their emergency procedures with practiced efficiency. But then the situation deteriorated rapidly. The port engine failed completely with a sound like a massive cough, followed by silence from that side of the aircraft that was immediately noticeable. The aircraft yawed to the left as it lost thrust on that side, and the pilots corrected with rudder and aileron inputs. Passengers gasped and some screamed as the aircraft's motion became noticeably different. The flight attendants, who had been trying to maintain calm, now moved quickly to secure the cabin and prepare for potential emergency landing procedures. What the passengers and crew did not know, what could not be conveyed through the captain's carefully worded announcements, was that the engine failure had caused damage beyond the engine itself. Debris from the failed turbine had penetrated the fuselage in multiple locations, had damaged hydraulic systems, and had compromised the structural integrity of part of the wing. The aircraft was still flyable, but it was now a serious emergency that required more than simply diverting to the nearest airport. The pilots declared an emergency with air traffic control and began coordinating for an emergency landing at Denver with full crash and rescue response. In the operations center at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs, air defense controllers monitoring civilian airspace noted the emergency declaration from Flight 2847 and began standard tracking procedures. The aircraft's transponder showed its emergency status, its position, and its heading toward Denver. Controllers coordinated with FAA counterparts to ensure airspace was cleared and emergency services were ready. This was routine for the Air Defense Network, which tracked thousands of flights daily and dealt with aircraft emergencies regularly. But then a controller ran a secondary check on the passenger manifest through a database system that was not routine, that was in fact highly classified and used only in specific circumstances. The database search returned a flag that caused the controller to immediately escalate to his supervisor. The supervisor looked at the information, went pale, and picked up a secure phone line that connected directly to NORAD command. Within seconds, additional personnel were reviewing the information, confirming its accuracy, and making decisions about response protocols. Within minutes, orders were being transmitted to the 120th Fighter Squadron of the Colorado Air National Guard stationed at Buckley Space Force Base. Two F-22 Raptors were scrambled with instructions that made the pilots exchange glances of confusion, because they were being tasked not just to monitor the civilian aircraft but to provide direct assistance to a specific passenger aboard that aircraft. The F-22 Raptor is the most advanced air superiority fighter in the world, a fifth-generation aircraft with stealth capabilities, supercruise performance, and avionics that allow it to dominate any combat environment. The pilots who fly F-22s are among the elite of military aviation, individuals who have proven themselves exceptional among the already exceptional community of fighter pilots. They undergo training that is intense beyond what most people can imagine, develop skills that push the boundaries of human performance, and operate aircraft whose capabilities are themselves highly classified. The two pilots launching from Buckley that afternoon had accumulated thousands of hours in fighters, had combat experience, had trained against the best adversaries, and considered themselves prepared for any situation. They launched within minutes of receiving the scramble order, their F-22s accelerating down the runway and climbing at angles that would seem impossible to anyone accustomed to civilian aircraft. They established contact with air traffic control and received vectors toward the position of Flight 2847, which was now about 60 miles west of Denver and descending through 20,000 feet. The lead pilot, whose call sign was Viper 1, contacted his operations center for additional information about the mission, asking why they were being sent to assist a civilian aircraft when that was typically handled by other assets. The operations controller's response came over the secure frequency with unusual formality. The controller informed them that there was a passenger aboard Flight 2847 whose presence had been flagged by national security systems, that this passenger had capabilities relevant to the emergency situation, and that they were to establish communication with this passenger through specific protocols. The controller then provided a call sign that would identify the passenger, and instructed the pilots to use that call sign when establishing contact. The controller's voice had a quality that suggested this was information being passed down from very high levels of command, and the pilots acknowledged the instructions with professional discipline despite their confusion. Viper 1 and his wingman, Viper 2, intercepted Flight 2847 at 18,000 feet and established a visual formation off the aircraft's right wing. They could see the damage to the port engine, could see the streaks of fluid on the wing that indicated hydraulic problems, could assess that the aircraft was in serious difficulty. Viper 1 contacted Denver Approach Control and offered to provide visual assessment and assistance, and was told to stand by for further instructions. Then, over the secure military frequency that civilian aircraft could not access, the operations controller provided the specific call sign they were to use to contact the passenger aboard the 767. The call sign was Phantom 01. The moment the words came through their headsets, both F-22 pilots reacted in a way that would have been visible to anyone watching their aircraft. The F-22's flight paths wavered slightly as the pilots' hands unconsciously moved on their controls in response to shock. There was complete silence on the frequency for several seconds, a gap in communication that was highly unusual in military aviation where radio discipline is constant and automatic. Finally, Viper 1's voice came back, and it was missing all of its previous professional detachment. Operations, Viper 1. Say again that call sign. Confirm you said Phantom 01. The operations controller confirmed the call sign, and added that the information was verified through the highest security channels, that the passenger aboard Flight 2847 was indeed Phantom 01, and that they were authorized to establish direct communication. The controller's voice made it clear that this was not an error, not a mistake, but rather information that was as shocking to him as it was to the pilots. In the F-22 community, among the pilots who flew the most advanced fighters and considered themselves at the pinnacle of military aviation, there were legends. There were stories of pilots whose skills transcended the normal boundaries of ability, whose achievements existed in classified files that almost no one could access, whose operations had changed the course of history in ways that would never be publicly known. Most of these legends were dismissed as exaggerations, as the mythology that accumulates around elite communities, as stories that grew in the telling. But some legends were known to be true because they appeared in classified briefings, because senior officers who had been present during specific operations confirmed them, because the evidence existed in documents that required the highest security clearances to access. Phantom 01 was the most legendary of all these legends. The call sign appeared in files that detailed operations so sensitive that simply knowing about them required presidential authorization. Phantom 01 had flown missions that were not just classified but had been actively erased from official records, missions where the slightest mistake would have triggered international incidents or worse. Phantom 01 had capabilities that exceeded even the most elite special operations pilots, had been cleared for operations that no one else could conduct, and had succeeded in situations where failure would have meant catastrophe on a national or global scale. Among the few details that were known to pilots with sufficient clearance was that Phantom 01 had flown an operation during a crisis in the Middle East that had prevented the use of weapons of mass destruction, had done so alone and without support, and had accomplished objectives that an entire squadron would have been expected to fail. Phantom 01 had flown through air defense networks that were considered impenetrable, had operated aircraft in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics, and had extracted intelligence that had saved thousands of lives. The operation had earned every medal that existed, but they could never be awarded because acknowledging the operation would compromise national security. Phantom 01's name appeared on a list of fewer than 20 individuals in the entire history of American military aviation whose achievements placed them in a category beyond measurement. The F-22 pilots had been briefed about Phantom 01 during advanced training, but only in the vaguest terms, and with the understanding that they would almost certainly never encounter this individual or be involved in operations at that level. The fact that Phantom 01 was aboard a civilian aircraft in distress, that they were being instructed to provide assistance, and that they were about to establish direct communication with someone whose legend exceeded their own elite status, created a moment of profound shock that both pilots were struggling to process. Viper 1 forced himself to focus on the mission, to set aside the implications of what he had just learned, and to follow the procedures he had been given. He switched to the emergency frequency that civilian aircraft monitored and spoke with carefully controlled professionalism. Civilian Aircraft Flight 2847, this is Viper 1 of the United States Air Force. We are F-22 fighters in formation on your right wing to provide assistance. We need to establish communication with the passenger in seat 27 Foxtrot. This is a United States military emergency protocol. Please pass this message to that passenger and ask them to identify themselves to flight crew. In the cockpit of Flight 2847, the captain and first officer exchanged confused glances. They were dealing with a serious mechanical emergency, were coordinating their approach to Denver, and were managing a cabin full of frightened passengers. The last thing they expected was military fighters asking to speak with a specific passenger. But the authority in the F-22 pilot's voice made it clear this was not a request they could ignore. The captain keyed the intercom to the senior flight attendant and relayed the message, asking her to go to seat 27F and bring that passenger to the cockpit immediately. The senior flight attendant, whose name was Rebecca, received the message with equal confusion. She was in the forward galley, had been preparing emergency equipment, and was trying to maintain her own composure while projecting calm to passengers. She acknowledged the captain's instructions and began moving down the aisle toward row 27, wondering what could possibly be so important about a passenger that military fighters would specifically request contact during an emergency. She reached row 27 and looked at the teenager sleeping in the aisle seat, then at the empty middle seat, then at the window. Her eyes tracked across the space exactly as they had done multiple times before during the flight, seeing the window and the view beyond it, somehow not registering the woman who sat in that seat despite looking directly at her. Rebecca felt a strange cognitive dissonance, a sense that something was wrong with her perception, but her mind automatically smoothed over the discontinuity the way it had been doing for hours. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, addressing the teenager. "I need to speak with the passenger in the window seat." The teenager woke groggily and looked at her with confusion. "There's nobody there," he said. "It's just me in this row." Rebecca looked again at the window seat and this time, because she was actively searching for someone, because the military had specifically identified this seat, because her brain was forced to confront the impossibility of an empty seat when she had been told someone was there, she finally saw the woman. It was like one of those optical illusions where you suddenly perceive the image that was hidden in plain sight all along, and once you see it you cannot understand how you missed it before. The woman sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, looking directly at Rebecca with eyes that were calm and knowing. Rebecca gasped audibly, took a step backward in shock, and nearly stumbled into the seats behind her. The woman made no move, no gesture of reassurance, simply continued to look at her with an expression that conveyed understanding of what Rebecca was experiencing. The teenager looked at the window seat, saw the woman for the first time despite sitting beside her for 3 hours, and his eyes went wide with an expression that combined confusion and fear. "How did you?" Rebecca began, but couldn't formulate the question. How did the woman get there? Had she been there the whole flight? Why hadn't anyone noticed her? The questions crowded into Rebecca's mind, but none of them seemed to capture the profound strangeness of what was happening. The woman spoke for the first time since boarding the aircraft, and her voice was calm and precise. "I need to speak with the pilots immediately. This is a matter of national security. Please take me to the cockpit now." Rebecca nodded automatically, responding to the authority in the woman's voice, and stepped aside to let her out of the row. The woman moved into the aisle with the same fluid efficiency she had displayed when boarding, and followed Rebecca toward the front of the aircraft. As they passed other passengers, heads turned to follow their movement, and expressions of confusion appeared on faces as people saw the woman for the first time. Flight attendants working in the cabin stopped what they were doing and stared, recognizing her as someone they had somehow failed to notice despite walking past her dozens of times. The collective realization rippling through the cabin created an atmosphere of unease that added to the tension already present from the emergency situation. Rebecca reached the cockpit door, knocked in the specific pattern that indicated she needed entry, and waited for the pilots to unlock it. When the door opened, she practically pushed the woman inside and then stood in the doorway herself, unable to process what was happening but knowing that she needed to witness whatever came next. The captain and first officer turned to see who had entered their cockpit, and their expressions mirrored the confusion and shock that Rebecca had experienced. The woman stepped forward and spoke with absolute calm despite the crisis occurring around her. "My name is classified. My call sign is Phantom 01. I am a covert operations pilot with the United States Special Operations Command. I have capabilities relevant to this emergency. The F-22 fighters off your wing have been instructed to establish communication with me. Please put me on the frequency they're monitoring." The captain stared at her, his mind trying to process multiple impossibilities at once. A covert operations pilot aboard his aircraft. F-22 fighters specifically asking for her. During a mechanical emergency that was already beyond his worst nightmares. He looked at his first officer, who looked equally stunned, then back at the woman who stood in his cockpit with an expression of complete confidence. "I don't understand," the captain said. Why are you on my aircraft?" "That's classified," she replied. "What's not classified is that your aircraft is in serious trouble, that the damage from your engine failure has compromised more systems than you realize, and that you're going to need assistance beyond what Denver Emergency Services can provide. The F-22s are here because I was flagged in national security databases when you declared your emergency. Now please put me on the radio with them so we can coordinate." The captain made a decision based on instinct and the absolute authority in her voice. He gestured to the radio panel and indicated which frequency the F-22s were monitoring. The woman leaned forward and keyed the microphone. "Viper 1, this is Phantom 01. Authentication code Alpha Whiskey 79er Delta Foxtrot. Confirm authentication." There was a pause on the frequency, and then Viper 1's voice came back, and it was clear he was struggling to maintain professional composure. "Phantom 01, Viper 1. Authentication confirmed. It's an honor, ma'am. We're here to provide any assistance you require. Viper 1, I need you to conduct a detailed visual inspection of this aircraft from your position. Focus on the port wing, fuselage damage near the engine mount, and hydraulic fluid trails. Give me a complete assessment." The F-22 moved in closer to the 767, and Viper 1 conducted the inspection with practiced precision. His voice came back over the frequency with information that made the captain's face go pale. The damage was more extensive than they had realized. Debris from the engine failure had created multiple fuselage breaches, had severed redundant hydraulic lines, and had caused structural damage that compromised the wing's integrity. The aircraft was still flying, but it was in far worse condition than the instruments in the cockpit were indicating. Phantom 01 listened to the assessment, processed the information with the rapid analytical capability that had made her legendary, and began formulating a solution. She turned to the captain and first officer and spoke with calm authority. Your primary flight controls are going to fail within the next 15 minutes. The hydraulic damage is progressive, and you're losing fluid faster than your systems are indicating. Your backup systems will maintain some control, but not enough for a conventional landing. Denver is too far. You need to put this aircraft down in the next 10 minutes. The captain's face showed the horror of what she was suggesting. There's nowhere to land out here. We're over mountainous terrain. The nearest airport besides Denver is Colorado Springs, and we can't make it there either. Phantom 01 moved to the cockpit window and looked at the terrain below. They were passing over an area of relatively flat land between mountain ranges, agricultural territory with long stretches of open fields. She processed the landscape with the same tactical assessment capability she used in combat situations, identifying possibilities, calculating distances, evaluating options. There, she said, pointing to a section of land ahead and to their right. That's a private airstrip used for crop dusters. The runway is short, probably 3,500 feet, unpaved, but it's your only option. I can talk you through an emergency landing there. The captain looked at where she was pointing and felt his stomach drop. Landing a Boeing 767 on a strip designed for small agricultural aircraft was impossible. The aircraft needed at least 5,000 feet of runway under ideal conditions, and these conditions were anything but ideal. But looking at his instruments, seeing the hydraulic pressure continuing to drop, feeling the controls becoming less responsive, he realized she was right. They had no other choice. Viper 1, Phantom 01 spoke into the radio. I need you to coordinate with air traffic control. Declare an emergency landing at the private airstrip at coordinates. She rattled off the GPS coordinates with precision, and get emergency services moving to that location immediately. We're going to put this aircraft down there in approximately 8 minutes. Phantom 01, Viper 1. That strip isn't long enough for a 767. This is going to be extremely dangerous. Viper 1, I'm aware of the parameters. I've landed larger aircraft in worse conditions. Coordinate the emergency response and stay with us. We're going to need you to verify our approach path and provide course corrections. The F-22 pilot acknowledged the instructions, and his voice carried a note of awe at what he was hearing. Phantom 01 was going to attempt something that most pilots would consider impossible, and she spoke about it with the same calm she might use to discuss routine procedures. She turned back to the captain and first officer. I'm going to take the controls. You're going to follow my instructions exactly. Your first officer will maintain communication with Viper 1 and handle the landing gear and flaps. Your flight engineer will manage the remaining hydraulic systems and engine power settings. You're going to trust me completely because we have one chance to do this right. The captain started to object, started to assert his authority as pilot in command, but the woman's eyes stopped him. There was something in those eyes, a combination of confidence and capability and absolute certainty, that made him understand he was in the presence of someone whose skills exceeded anything he could imagine. He nodded and moved out of the left seat. Phantom 01 slid into the captain's seat and put her hands on the controls. She felt the aircraft respond to her inputs, felt the degraded state of the hydraulic systems, felt the damage that was making the aircraft difficult to control. But she had flown aircraft in far worse condition, had brought crippled fighters back from missions where they should have been lost, had developed an understanding of aircraft control that went beyond technical knowledge into something approaching intuition. She began the descent toward the private airstrip, dropping the aircraft's altitude more rapidly than civilian procedures would normally allow, but she needed to get on the ground before control systems failed completely. She coordinated with the first officer on the deployment of flaps and landing gear, timing each configuration change to maximize their effect on the aircraft's flight path. She spoke to Viper 1, who provided visual confirmation of their approach path and made course correction suggestions that she incorporated with precision. The passengers in the cabin could feel the change in the aircraft's attitude, could sense that something significant was happening beyond what they had been told. Flight attendants had strapped themselves into jump seats and prepared for impact, following emergency procedures but having no idea that the person flying their aircraft was someone whose capabilities were legendary even among military pilots. The cabin was silent except for the sound of the engines and the creaking of the damaged structure. Phantom 01 lined up on the short runway with perfect precision, adjusting her approach angle to compensate for the loss of hydraulic pressure, calculating the exact moment to reduce power, timing the flare with the precision that came from thousands of hours of emergency landings and training and actual operations. The runway looked impossibly short as they descended toward it, a narrow strip of dirt between fields that seemed designed for aircraft a fraction of their size. "Full flaps," she commanded, and the first officer deployed them despite the amber warning lights indicating hydraulic problems. The aircraft slowed but remained stable in her hands. "Landing gear down." The gear deployed with sounds that suggested the system was near failure, but all three sets locked into position. The F-22s bracketed their approach, one on each wing, providing visual reference and moral support to the pilots attempting something that seemed impossible. Viper 1 spoke constant encouragement over the frequency, confirming approach angles and altitudes, but mostly just being present as a witness to what was about to happen. Phantom 01 brought the 767 over the threshold of the runway at a speed that was slower than recommended but necessary given the short landing distance. She held the aircraft off the runway for what seemed like an eternity, bleeding off speed while maintaining perfect control despite the nearly failed control systems. When the main wheels touched the dirt runway, she deployed full reverse thrust and applied maximum braking, using every technique she knew to stop the massive aircraft in the available distance. The 767 thundered down the short runway, throwing up clouds of dust, shaking and groaning as its brakes and reverse thrusters fought to stop tens of thousands of pounds of aircraft. The end of the runway approached with terrifying speed, and for a moment it seemed they would overrun and crash into the field beyond. But Phantom 01's calculations had been exact, her control inputs perfect, and the aircraft came to a stop with less than 100 feet of runway remaining. There was a moment of absolute silence in the cockpit, followed by the sound of the first officer breathing a prayer of thanksgiving. The captain sat in the right seat with his hands shaking, unable to quite believe what he had just witnessed. Through the windscreen they could see emergency vehicles approaching across the fields, could see the F-22s performing a low pass overhead in salute, could see the impossible landing they had just survived. Phantom 01 shut down the engines and went through post-landing procedures with the same calm efficiency she had displayed throughout the emergency. She stood from the captain's seat and prepared to return to the cabin, but the captain stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Who are you?" he asked. "Really?" She looked at him with eyes that had seen things he would never know about, that had witnessed operations he would never be briefed on, that carried the weight of missions that would remain classified long after they were both dead. "I'm someone who was on your aircraft," she said simply. "That's all you need to know and all you're authorized to know. What happened here will be classified. You'll receive instructions from government representatives about what to include in your report. The passengers will be debriefed and asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. Your flight recorders will be seized for national security reasons. This emergency landing will be attributed to crew skill and luck, and my presence will be erased from all records." She moved past him and opened the cockpit door. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to react to the landing, some crying with relief, some sitting in shocked silence, some beginning to ask questions about what had happened. Flight attendants were preparing to evacuate the aircraft now that it was safely on the ground. Emergency vehicles were surrounding them, and personnel were approaching to assist. Phantom 01 moved through the cabin toward the emergency exit, and once again she seemed to fade from people's awareness. Passengers who had seen her enter the cockpit, who had watched her take control of the aircraft, who knew she had saved their lives, found their eyes sliding past her as she walked by. By the time she reached the exit door, most of them would be unable to remember what she looked like or confirm she had been aboard at all. She exited the aircraft down the emergency slide and walked away from the scene. Within minutes a black SUV appeared, driving across the field to her position. She climbed inside and the vehicle drove away, taking her from the scene before official debriefings began. Back at the aircraft, as passengers were being evacuated and emergency personnel were conducting their assessments, the F-22 pilots were landing at Buckley Space Force Base. Viper 1 sat in the briefing room still processing what he had experienced. He had spoken with Phantom 01, had watched her land a crippled airliner on an impossibly short runway, had witnessed capabilities that exceeded even his highest expectations. The legend had been real, and it had been more impressive than any story could convey. The captain of Flight 2847 would eventually file a report that attributed the successful emergency landing to crew coordination and favorable conditions, making no mention of the woman who had actually saved the aircraft and everyone aboard. The event would be recorded in aviation safety databases as a successful emergency landing, with nothing to indicate the extraordinary circumstances that had actually occurred. And the woman who had been aboard Flight 2847 would return to invisibility, moving through the world like a ghost, protecting the country through skills that almost no one knew existed. She was Phantom 01, and she would remain unnoticed until the next time her country needed someone who existed beyond the normal boundaries of military operations.